My name is Zoe, and at 31 years old, I never expected my own husband to set me up for public humiliation on Christmas Eve. We were sitting at an exclusive Chicago steakhouse surrounded by his wealthy family when the waiter handed me an $8,500 bill. My mother-in-law Vivian smirked as my card was loudly declined. She announced to the entire room that the Southside charity case had finally run out of luck and ruined their perfect holiday. What she did not know was that my account was frozen because a $1.2 billion wire transfer from a corporate buyout had just hit my bank, and I was about to purchase the very debt that kept her fake high society life afloat. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The ambient glow of the crystal chandeliers at the Wellington Steakhouse cast a warm light over the remnants of our lavish Christmas dinner. The restaurant was the crown jewel of the Chicago culinary scene, a place where reservations had to be made 6 months in advance. The table was cluttered with the debris of extreme indulgence. Empty bottles of a rare Bordeaux that my brother-in-law Darius had insisted on ordering littered the white linen tablecloth. Half-eaten bone and tomahawk steaks and the smeared remains of truffle mashed potatoes sat on gold-rimmed plates. For the past 3 hours, I had sat in relative silence, enduring the exhausting performance that was my husband Julian and his family. His mother Vivian sat at the head of the table holding court like a monarch. She wore a tailored crimson dress and a string of pearls that she made sure everyone knew were genuine vintage. All evening, she had loudly bragged about her exclusive Jack and Jill Country Club events and her connections from Howard University. Every story she told was designed to remind everyone in earshot of her old money status, and every glance she threw my way was designed to remind me that I did not belong. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I built my biotech startup from the ground up, working 18-hour days to fund my research in stem cell skincare for women of color. Vivian never respected my work. To her, I was just a girl from the wrong zip code who had somehow tricked her lawyer's son into marriage. The conversation around the table was a constant stream of bragging and passive-aggressive jabs. My sister-in-law Chloe laughed loudly at a joke her husband Darius made about people who actually have to work for a living. Darius was a flashy crypto investor who wore suits that were a little too tight and watches that were a little too shiny. Julian sat next to me, nodding along to everything his mother and sister said. He was a junior partner at Vivian's law firm, completely dependent on her approval for his career and his self-esteem. Whenever Vivian made a snide remark about my clothes or my business, Julian would just look down at his plate or excuse himself to the restroom. He never defended me, but tonight I thought things would be different. Tonight I thought we had an understanding. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open, and our waiter approached the table. He was dressed in a pristine tuxedo, moving with the silent efficiency that you expect at a place that charges $100 for a piece of steak. He carried a sleek black leather folder. The moment he stepped up to the table, the loud chatter abruptly stopped. Vivian paused mid-sentence, adjusting her posture and looking expectantly at the waiter. Chloe and Darius suddenly found their water glasses absolutely fascinating. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. The family tradition dictated that the most successful person at the table handled the holiday dinner bill. For years, that had been Vivian. But earlier this week, Vivian had called Julian and declared that since my little lotion business was supposedly doing so well, I should be the one to treat the family to Christmas dinner. It was a test. A blatant power play to see if I would bend to her will. I had agreed to pay, not to appease Vivian, but because I wanted to enjoy a peaceful Christmas for once. I had recently closed a massive deal that I was keeping completely secret until the ink was fully dry. So a few days ago, I had handed Julian $10,000 in crisp cash. I told him to hold on to it and pay the restaurant in advance, so we would not have to deal with any awkwardness at the table. I wanted everything handled quietly and elegantly. The waiter stopped directly next to my chair. He did not go to Julian. He did not go to Vivian. He placed the heavy leather folder right next to my coffee cup. I looked at Julian. He was staring intensely at the salt shaker, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. My heart did a slow, heavy thump. Something was wrong. I opened the folder. The receipt was incredibly long, detailing every absurd appetizer, every triple shot espresso, and all 6 bottles of the expensive wine Darius had ordered without asking. At the very bottom, printed in bold black ink, was the total: $8,542. I looked at Julian again. He refused to meet my eyes. He shifted in his seat and took a sudden, desperate gulp of water. The cash was gone. He had not paid the restaurant. He had not done the one simple thing I asked him to do. Vivian leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Her eyes were gleaming with predatory excitement. "Well, Zoe," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "are you going to keep the gentleman waiting all night? We all know how much you love to talk about your little startup. Let us see if it actually pays the bills." I kept my face perfectly neutral. I reached into my purse, bypassing my usual cards, and pulled out my standard business debit card. I placed it on the silver tray on top of the receipt. The waiter nodded gracefully, picked up the folder, and walked away. The silence at the table was suffocating. Darius smirked and leaned back, picking his teeth with a golden toothpick. Chloe pulled out her phone and started scrolling, looking completely unbothered. Julian finally looked at me, his eyes pleading with me to just stay quiet and go along with whatever was about to happen. 5 minutes passed. Every second felt like an hour. I knew I had more than enough money in that business account to cover a dinner 10 times this expensive. I had checked the balance that morning. But when the waiter returned, his professional composure had cracked just a fraction. He walked slowly back to my side of the table. He leaned down, placing the black folder closely in front of me. "I am terribly sorry, madam," the waiter whispered, trying his best to preserve my dignity. "But the card has been declined." He spoke quietly, but in the dead silence of the private dining room, his words echoed like a gunshot. Declined. The word hung in the air. Vivian let out a sharp, theatrical gasp. She threw her napkin onto her plate and sat back as if she had been physically struck. "Declined," she repeated, practically shouting the word. She looked around the room, making sure the waiters at the nearby serving stations heard her. "Good heavens, I cannot believe this. I am sitting at the Wellington on Christmas Eve and my daughter-in-law cannot even afford her own meal." I looked down at the slip of paper sticking out of the folder. It clearly said, "Transaction denied. Please contact your financial institution." I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. It was the kind of calm you feel when you realize a hurricane is hitting and there is no point in running. Vivian stood up from her chair. She was not going to let this moment pass without squeezing every drop of humiliation from it. "This is exactly what I warned you about, Julian," she announced, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my husband. "I told you years ago that you cannot turn a Southside charity case into a woman of substance. You thought she was an entrepreneur. She is a fraud. She sits here eating truffles and drinking imported wine on our time, pretending to be on our level, and her card bounces like a bad check at a corner store." "Mother, please," Julian whispered weakly. "Keep your voice down." "I will not keep my voice down," Vivian snapped. She grabbed her crystal wine glass and took a defiant sip. "She has ruined Christmas. She embarrassed this family in one of the finest establishments in the city. A woman with real breeding, a woman from a respectable background, would never put her husband in such a shameful position. But what can you expect from someone who grew up sharing a bathroom with 5 other people?" Chloe chimed in, rolling her eyes. "Seriously, Zoe, this is beyond tacky. If your little lotion company is going bankrupt, you should have just told us. We could have taken you to a diner." Darius let out a loud, barking laugh. "Hey, babe, do not be too hard on her. Times are tough for small businesses. Maybe she can sell some of that miracle cream out of the trunk of her car to pay the bill." I ignored Chloe and Darius. I ignored Vivian pacing at the head of the table. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Julian. My husband of 5 years. The man who stood at the altar and promised to protect me. He knew the truth. He knew exactly why this was happening, and he knew about the cash. I waited for him to speak. I waited for him to stand up, pull the $10,000 out of his jacket pocket, and explain that there had been a misunderstanding. I waited for him to tell his mother to stop speaking to his wife like she was trash on the sidewalk. Julian looked at my debit card sitting rejected on the silver tray. Then he looked at Vivian. His shoulders slumped. He did not reach for his wallet. He did not raise his voice. He just sat there letting me drown in his family's toxic judgment. I realized in that exact moment that the man sitting next to me was not a partner. He was a parasite. And the woman screaming at the head of the table was not just a snob. She was an enemy. I slowly reached out and picked up my declined card. I slipped it back into my purse, knowing exactly why the bank had frozen my assets. And I smiled. "Where is the cash?" Julian, I asked. My voice was dangerously low and steady. It cut through the tension in the room like a scalpel. He flinched at the sound of his name. For a second, he looked like a cornered animal trying to find an escape route, but there was nowhere to hide. Not in this private dining room, and certainly not from me. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed napkin. "I do not have it," he mumbled. His voice was so pathetic and small that I almost felt embarrassed for him. Almost. "What do you mean you do not have it?" I pressed. "I handed you an envelope with $10,000 in crisp, $100 bills on Tuesday morning. I told you to come to the restaurant and prepay the manager." "Where is it?" Julian looked at his sister Chloe, and then down at his lap. "I lent it to Chloe," he finally muttered. The words hit the air and hung there. I stared at him, letting the absolute absurdity of his statement wash over me. "You lent $10,000 of my money to your sister." Chloe scoffed loudly and flipped her perfectly straightened hair over her shoulder. "Oh, do not be so dramatic, Zoe," she snapped. "Darius and I needed liquid cash to cover some unexpected closing costs on a new investment property. Julian knew we were good for it. It is family money anyway." "Family money," I repeated. The audacity was almost breathtaking. That was money I earned from my business, money I specifically set aside so we could have one peaceful dinner without your mother holding the bill over my head. Julian suddenly found a burst of false courage. "Well, you were supposed to get paid today anyway," he shot back, his voice rising defensively. "You told me Milanix was expecting a vendor payment this week. I figured your little startup could cover the dinner tonight and Chloe could just pay me back whenever her crypto fund dispersed the profits. You are always talking about how great your company is doing. So why did your card bounce, Zoe? Why are we sitting here looking like fools?" He was trying to flip the script. He was trying to make me the villain because he stole my money to give to his spoiled sister. He was shifting the blame to mask his own staggering incompetence and complete lack of respect for my hard work. Before I could even respond to Julian and his cowardly deflection, Vivian decided to strike. She saw blood in the water and lunged with the ferocity of a starved predator. She stood up abruptly from the head of the table. Her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, echoing off the mahogany walls. Without a word of warning, she reached across the table and snatched my leather purse right out of my hands. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice sharp and commanding. Vivian did not answer. She gripped the bottom of my purse, turned it upside down, and violently shook it over the center of the pristine white tablecloth. Everything I had inside came spilling out in a chaotic mess right next to the expensive remnants of their luxurious dinner. A half-empty tube of drugstore lip gloss rolled across the table and clinked against Darius's crystal wine glass. A crumpled-up Subway card fluttered down next to the remaining truffle mashed potatoes. A handful of old receipts from a local coffee shop fell onto the silver tray. And finally, my basic business debit card landed right in the middle of the mess, looking remarkably unimpressive under the glowing chandeliers. The entire table stared at the pathetic pile of everyday items. To them, it was undeniable evidence of my poverty and my failure. To me, it was just the reality of a busy woman who spent her time building an empire instead of organizing her handbag. But Vivian was absolutely thrilled. Her eyes widened with malicious joy as she began to pick through my belongings with the tip of her manicured finger like she was examining garbage in an alleyway. "Look at this," Vivian announced to the room. Her voice was intentionally loud, projecting her cruelty so it would carry through the heavy wooden doors and into the main dining area for anyone walking by to hear. "Look at the harsh reality of our grand entrepreneur." She picked up my bright yellow Subway card and held it up to the chandelier light as if it were a diseased artifact. A public transit card. My son is a junior partner at a prestigious law firm, and his wife rides the train with common laborers. Do you know how incredibly embarrassing it is for me to explain this to my friends at the Jack and Jill Country Club? They ask me what my daughter-in-law drives, and I have to pretend I did not hear the question to save our family name. She dropped the card and picked up the crumpled receipts, her face twisting in pure disgust. Coffee from a corner bodega, cheap lip gloss that you can buy at a pharmacy. This is what you brought into my family, Julian. This is the absolute squalor you married. Mother, that is enough, Julian whispered. But he did not move a single muscle to stop her. He did not reach across the table to defend me. He just sat there looking thoroughly embarrassed by the lip gloss and the bodega receipts, completely abandoning me to the wolves. It is not enough, Vivian shrieked, slamming her hand flat against the table. She pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at my basic debit card. You sit here year after year and let us believe you are building some massive biotech empire. Melanix. What a pathetic joke. You play with your little lotions and creams in a rented laboratory on the South Side and pretend you are a real chief executive officer. You are nothing but a fraud who tricked my successful son into marrying you because you desperately wanted access to our elite lifestyle. And now we are sitting at the Wellington on Christmas Eve with an $8,500 bill that your completely empty wallet cannot pay. Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sounded like glass breaking. Honestly, Zoe, it is just sad at this point. You should just go back to whatever neighborhood you came from and stay there. You clearly cannot keep up with our circle, and you never will. You do not have the breeding or the capital. Darius leaned forward, resting his heavy elbows heavily on the table. His expensive replica watch clanked loudly against the wood, a fake symbol of wealth that I could spot from a mile away. He had a smug, greasy smile plastered on his face. He reached into the inner pocket of his overly tight suit jacket and pulled out a gold money clip stuffed with thick stacks of cash. He slowly and deliberately peeled off a single crisp $100 bill. He flicked his wrist and tossed the bill aggressively across the table. It floated through the air and landed right on top of my spilled coffee shop receipts. Tell you what Zoe, Darius said, his voice dripping with overwhelming condescension and arrogance. Since your little lotion company is clearly bankrupt and you are dead broke, I am feeling incredibly generous tonight. Take that $100, order yourself an Uber X. Get out of here so the real adults can handle this grown-up bill without you ruining the holiday aesthetics. He paused and looked over at Chloe, sharing a deeply cruel smirk with his entitled wife. And tomorrow morning, you can come down to my new office in the financial district. We just fired our overnight cleaning lady because she was stealing. If you scrub the executive toilets and mop the lobby floors before my real investors arrive, I will pay you $20 an hour in cash. You can slowly work off your massive debt to Julian that way, since you clearly do not have any real marketable skills in the corporate world. The table immediately erupted into raucous laughter. Chloe threw her head back and cackled, holding her stomach. Vivian let out a dignified, booming chuckle, looking incredibly proud and pleased with her son-in-law for putting me in my place. Even Julian cracked a small, nervous smile, visibly relieved that the negative attention was no longer focused on his cowardly theft of my cash. They all sat there laughing at the poor, pathetic girl from the wrong side of the tracks. They honestly believed they had broken my spirit. They thought they had finally exposed me as a desperate fraud, stripped away my dignity, and permanently put me back in the lower class, where they firmly believed I belonged. I looked down at the single $100 bill sitting on the table. I looked at my scattered receipts, my transit card, and my cheap lip gloss. Then I slowly looked up at the faces of the arrogant people I had unfortunately called family for the past 5 agonizing years. I did not feel the sudden urge to cry. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness, embarrassment, or shame burning in my chest. I did not want to run away and hide in the restroom. The only thing coursing through my veins in that exact moment was absolute ice-cold clarity. They had just shown me exactly who they were down to their very core, and they had absolutely no idea who I had become today. I did not reach out for the $100 bill. I did not scramble frantically to pick up my scattered belongings from the tablecloth. I simply sat back comfortably in my heavy wooden chair, crossed my arms confidently over my chest, and let a slow, deeply chilling, calculated smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of surrender. It was a calculated, lethal smile that silently screamed the game was completely over, and they had already lost everything. They just did not know it yet. Darius's loud laughter slowly died down in his throat as he finally noticed the dangerous look flashing in my eyes. Vivian's smug, victorious expression faltered for just a fraction of a second as she stared at me, suddenly unsure of her footing. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch across the dining room, letting my chilling smile completely unnerve every single one of them. I was going to systematically destroy their entire fake empire from the ground up, and I was going to enjoy every single second of their spectacular ruin. My chilling smile seemed to finally break through Vivian's armor of arrogance. She did not like the way I was looking at her. She expected me to cower. She expected me to beg Julian for help or run out of the restaurant in tears. When I did, neither her face hardened into a mask of pure spite. "If you are not going to leave," Vivian snapped, slamming her crystal water glass down on the table, "then you are at least going to make yourself useful. Since you cannot afford to pay for the food you just consumed, you can work off your debt by acting like the hired help." She gestured dismissively toward the center of the table, where the remains of our extravagant meal sat. Box up the leftover tomahawk steaks and the truffle mashed potatoes. Do it neatly. Darius and Chloe will take them home. And when you are finished with that, go out to the coat check and fetch our winter coats. The manager is supposedly coming back to discuss how we are going to handle your fraudulent card, and I refuse to sit here looking at you pretending to be an equal. If you are broke, you can serve. I looked at Julian. He was staring intensely at the expensive floral centerpiece, acting as if the arrangement of winter roses was the most fascinating thing in the world. He was completely comfortable watching his mother treat his wife like a servant. I felt a cold wave of disgust wash over me, but I kept my face perfectly blank. I slowly stood up from my chair. I did not argue. I did not throw a drink in Vivian's face, even though the thought was incredibly tempting. Instead, I reached for the stack of sleek black takeout boxes the waiter had left on the side station. I began packing the leftover food. I wanted them to feel powerful. I wanted them to get so incredibly comfortable in their false sense of superiority that they would never see the execution coming. As I meticulously packed slices of premium beef into the boxes, the table immediately went back to ignoring my humanity. Chloe leaned over and touched Darius's arm, her diamond rings catching the light. "Tell Mother about the new fund baby," Chloe cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She looked over at me with a side eye, making sure I was listening. "We have just had the most incredible quarter." Darius puffed out his chest, adjusting the lapels of his shiny suit. He leaned back and took a sip of his wine, acting like a Wall Street titan holding a press conference. "It is a decentralized finance liquidity pool," Darius announced, using a string of buzzwords that I knew for a fact Vivian did not understand. But Vivian smiled anyway because the tone of his voice implied massive wealth. "We just secured $5 million in seed capital from some of my connections in Dubai. The returns are going to be astronomical. We are talking 20% month over month. It is high-level financial architecture. You really need a certain type of pedigree to even get in the room with these investors." Vivian clapped her hands together lightly, her eyes sparkling with greed and pride. "Oh, Darius, that is simply magnificent," she gushed. "It is so refreshing to have a real businessman in the family, someone who understands how money actually works on a global scale." She shot a venomous glare in my direction as I closed the lid on a takeout box. Unlike some people who waste their time playing chemist in a rented warehouse and calling it a company, Chloe giggled behind her manicured hand. "Seriously, Zoe," Chloe said, directing her attention fully to me now that the food was almost packed. "When are you going to give up on that little project of yours? What is it called again?" "Melanix. It sounds like a prescription drug for a skin disease." Darius laughed loudly. "It is glorified lotion, Chloe. That is all it is. She is mixing shea butter and aloe vera in a bathtub and trying to sell it to people who cannot even afford it. I paused for a second, my hands resting on the cool plastic of the takeout containers. Melanix was not glorified lotion. It was a cutting-edge biotech firm specializing in stem cell regeneration specifically formulated for melanin-rich skin. I had spent years securing patents. I had a team of world-class dermatologists and researchers on my payroll. My clinical trials had completely disrupted the dermatological industry, which was exactly why L'Oréal had just paid over $1 billion to acquire us. But I was not going to explain that to a woman who thought true success meant marrying a man with a fake portfolio. I just do not understand your business model. Zoe. Chloe continued, her voice echoing with elite condescension. Why on earth would you dedicate your entire life to creating products for a demographic that has no real disposable income? If you wanted to make actual money, you should have focused on the luxury anti-aging market for wealthy women. You know, people who can actually afford to shop at high-end department stores. But I guess you only know what you grew up around. Poverty breeds poverty. Vivian nodded in profound agreement. Exactly, Chloe. It is a fundamental lack of vision. She does not have the capacity to think like upper management. That is why she is standing there boxing up our leftovers like a common maid while your husband is managing $5 million funds. It is simply a matter of genetics and class. I finished stacking the white boxes. I picked up a damp cloth and calmly wiped my hands clean. I looked at Darius, who was practically glowing from all the unearned praise. He crossed his arms confidently, making sure his left wrist was prominently displayed so everyone could admire his massive diamond-encrusted watch. That is a very impressive watch, Darius, I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. Darius smirked, tilting his wrist to catch the light from the chandelier overhead. Thanks, Zoe. It is an Audemars Piguet Royal Oak, custom diamond setting. Cost me about $85,000. But when you are moving millions in the crypto space, you have to look the part. Clients need to know they are dealing with a heavy hitter. I walked slowly around the table until I was standing right next to his chair. I looked down at the heavy gold timepiece strapped to his wrist. I had spent the last 3 years navigating boardrooms full of real billionaires. I had negotiated contracts with venture capitalists who wore watches that cost more than Vivian's entire house. I knew exactly what real wealth looked like, and I knew exactly what desperate imitation looked like. It is a beautiful design, I said, leaning in just a fraction, but you might want to get your money back from whoever sold it to you. Darius frowned, his smug smile faltering. What are you talking about? I pointed a single finger at the face of the watch. The sweeping motion of the second hand is a dead giveaway. An authentic Audemars Piguet has a mechanical movement that glides perfectly smooth. Yours is ticking. It means there is a cheap quartz battery inside. Furthermore, the tapisserie pattern on the dial is stamped instead of engine-turned. The squares are too shallow and the spacing is uneven. And the diamonds on the bezel are cloudy, which means they are most likely cubic zirconia or incredibly low-grade lab stones. The entire table went completely silent. Chloe stopped playing with her rings. Vivian stared at me, her mouth slightly open. I looked Darius directly in his eyes. My voice was calm, clinical, and completely devastating. It is a very convincing replica, Darius. A good fake. Probably cost you about $300 on a sketchy website. But anyone with actual money can spot it from across the room. I suppose it makes sense, though. Fake watch for a fake fund. Darius's face turned a violent shade of purple. The veins in his neck began to bulge against his tight collar. He slammed his fist down on the table, making the silverware rattle violently against the plates. "You shut your mouth, you broke piece of trash!" He spat, his voice shaking with sheer rage. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. I make more in a day than your pathetic little lotion company makes in a year." He pushed his chair back roughly, looking like he was about to lunge across the table at me. Chloe grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with panic, as other diners in the restaurant started turning their heads to look at our private room. Vivian looked horrified, not because Darius was wearing a fake watch, but because the illusion of her perfect wealthy family was cracking in public. Before Darius could start screaming again, Julian finally moved. He jumped out of his chair and grabbed my arm with a crushing grip. His face was pale with embarrassment and panic. "That is enough," Julian hissed under his breath. He did not look at Darius. He did not tell his brother-in-law to calm down. He focused all of his misplaced anger solely on me. Julian pulled me forcefully away from the table, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. "We are leaving the room right now," he demanded. He practically dragged me toward the heavy oak doors, desperate to remove the source of the conflict, before Darius completely lost his temper and caused a scene that would permanently ruin Vivian's reputation at the Wellington Steakhouse. I did not fight him. I let him pull me out into the quiet, softly lit hallway, knowing that the real destruction was only just beginning. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room clicked shut behind us, cutting off the muffled sounds of Vivian attempting to smooth over the awkwardness with the remaining guests. The hallway of the Wellington Steakhouse was lined with vintage mirrors and dark mahogany panels, projecting an aura of quiet luxury that stood in stark contrast to the ugly reality of my marriage. Julian finally released his crushing grip on my arm. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not apologize for letting his mother treat me like a maid, or for standing by while his brother-in-law humiliated me with that $100 bill. Instead, he smoothed the lapels of his custom-tailored suit and let out a long, frustrated exhale. He looked at me not with the concern of a loving husband, but with the cold calculation of a corporate lawyer assessing a massive financial liability. I stood there rubbing my arm where his fingers had dug into my skin. I waited for him to speak. I expected him to scold me for antagonizing Darius, or to beg me to just play along for the rest of the evening so he would not look bad in front of his mother. I thought he might at least show a shred of remorse for stealing the $10,000 I had given him. But Julian reached into the inner breast pocket of his jacket. He did not pull out a checkbook to cover the dinner. He did not pull out his phone to call us a car to leave the restaurant. He pulled out a thick envelope made of heavy, expensive parchment paper. He held it out toward me, his face completely devoid of any warmth, empathy, or affection. It was a vicious, predatory look I had seen him give opposing counsel in the courtroom, but he had never directed it at me. I looked down at the envelope, my heart beating with a slow, steady rhythm. "Take it," Julian ordered, his voice dropping to a harsh, demanding whisper. He quickly glanced down the hallway to make sure no restaurant staff members were lingering nearby to witness this. I slowly reached out and took the envelope. It was not sealed. I flipped the flap open and pulled out a stack of neatly stapled legal documents. The bold heading at the top of the first page leaped out at me in stark black ink. "Petition for dissolution of marriage." I stared at the words. Divorce papers. He had brought divorce papers to a family Christmas dinner. He had them sitting quietly in his jacket pocket the entire time he watched his mother dump my purse on the table and listened to his sister mock my life's work. He knew exactly what was going to happen tonight, and he had come fully prepared to cut me loose. "I am making junior partner next month," Zoe Julian said, his tone entirely strictly business. "Mother is finally ready to hand over the reins of the firm to me, but she made one thing perfectly clear. I cannot step into a leadership role if I am tied to a sinking ship. Your little startup is a massive liability. You have been burning through cash for 3 years with absolutely nothing to show for it. You embarrassed me tonight with that declined card. You embarrassed my family in front of the most elite waiters in the city. I cannot afford to have my professional reputation dragged through the mud by a woman who refuses to accept her place in the economic hierarchy. You are completely out of your depth, and I am entirely done trying to pull you up to my level. Just sign the papers quietly. Do not make a scene. Do not drag this out in family court, because you know my mother will bury you in legal fees until you have absolutely nothing left to your name." I flipped to the second page of the document, reading through the terms he had clearly drafted with his mother's malicious guidance. It was an absolute slaughter. He was asking for full ownership of everything. Our shared bank accounts, the modest investments I had made before we were even married, and most insulting of all, he was demanding the deed to our townhouse. The beautiful townhouse in the Gold Coast neighborhood that I had found negotiated and secured using my own capital. I looked up at him, raising a single eyebrow. "You want the house, Julian. You are asking for the house as alimony." He had the absolute audacity to stand taller, puffing out his chest, as if he actually deserved it. "Yes, I want the house," Julian stated firmly. "Consider it adequate compensation for the 5 years of my life I wasted trying to support your delusions of grandeur. You practically lived in that laboratory while I was out actually building a respectable career. I paid the utility bills. I kept up appearances at the country club while you skipped events to play chemist. You owe me that property for the sheer amount of emotional stress you have caused this family. Mother agrees it is the only fair way to settle this cleanly and quietly. If you sign the deed over to me tonight, I will graciously agree not to go after the pathetic remnants of Melanix. You can keep your little lotion company and all of your business debt, and I keep the real estate. It is a win for both of us. I looked at the man standing in front of me. I thought about the sacred vows we took 5 years ago. I thought about the countless nights I had stayed up helping him study for the bar exam, when his mother had threatened to cut him off if he failed. I remembered the times I had swallowed my pride and attended his elitist Jack and Jill events, smiling politely while his wealthy friends made subtly racist remarks about my working-class neighborhood. I had been the perfect, supportive wife. But to Julian, I was just a stepping stone. A temporary accessory he thought he could discard the moment his mother dangled a promotion in front of his face. He actually believed he held all the power. He believed that because my debit card bounced, I was utterly defenseless. Sign it right now, Zoe. Julian pressed, pulling a sleek silver pen from his pocket and clicking it open. He held it out to me, his hand completely steady and confident. The manager is going to come back to that room any minute to deal with the bill. I want this done before we go back in there. I want to be able to tell my mother that the dead weight has officially been cut loose. If you do this the easy way, I might even give you a few days to pack your things before I change the locks on the doors. You are going to kick me out of my own home, right before the new year? I asked, keeping my voice intentionally even, hiding the absolute inferno of rage burning deeply in my chest. It is not your home anymore, Julian retorted, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. It belongs to the firm now. Mother advanced me the capital to pay for the recent kitchen renovations. The deed needs to be transferred exclusively to my name so I can use it as collateral for my partnership buy-in. You do not belong in that neighborhood anyway, Zoe. You never did. You will be much happier back on the south side, where you do not have to pretend to be something you are not. Go back to your roots. Consider this a favor. I stared at the silver pen in his hand. A normal woman would have broken down right there in the hallway. A normal woman would have cried, screamed, or slapped him across the face for the sheer level of betrayal and disrespect. I could have easily told him the truth right then and there. I could have told him that Melanix was not a sinking ship. I could have mentioned the $1.2 billion wire transfer from L'Oreal that had just cleared into my account. I could have watched him drop to his knees on the carpet and beg for forgiveness the moment he realized he was divorcing a billionaire. But that would have been entirely too easy. Julian did not deserve a quick realization. He deserved the slow, agonizing destruction of everything he thought he knew. He deserved to walk blindly into his own execution. I reached out and took the silver pen from his fingers. The metal was cold against my skin. I did not say a word. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I flipped to the final page of the divorce petition, right to the signature line where he had already signed his name in bold, confident strokes. I placed the document flat against the mahogany-paneled wall of the hallway. Julian let out a heavy breath. He had clearly been holding a look of profound relief washing over his face. He honestly thought he had won. Good girl, he condescended, his voice dripping with arrogance. This is the smartest business decision you have ever made in your entire life. Do not worry about the restaurant bill either. Once you sign that, I will go back in there and tell my mother to cover it. You can just slip out the back door and catch your train. It is over, Zoe. I pressed the tip of the pen to the heavy parchment paper. I signed my name with precise, elegant, and completely unshaking strokes. Zoe Hayes. I did not hesitate. I felt a massive, invisible weight lift off my shoulders the moment the ink dried. 5 years of constantly trying to prove my worth to a family that was determined to misunderstand me. 5 years of shrinking myself to make this mediocre man feel big. It was all officially over. I was finally free. I capped the pen and gathered the papers back into a neat stack. I turned to Julian, who was already holding his hand out expectantly to take the document, ready to run back into the dining room like a good little boy and show his mother the grand prize he had won. I placed the divorce papers firmly into his outstretched hand. I looked him dead in the eye, dropping the mask of the compliant, embarrassed wife entirely. My gaze was so intense that he physically took a half step backward, suddenly unsure of himself. I paid the down payment on that house with my seed round funding, I said. My voice was no longer a whisper. It was a cold, razor-sharp declaration of war. Julian frowned, looking down at the papers and then back up at me, clearly confused by my sudden shift in demeanor. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us, forcing him to look up at me in my heels. "You demanded the townhouse as alimony. You just legally claimed a property with a massive mortgage, completely waiving your rights to absolutely any other assets I might possess. I signed it over to you, Julian. The house is yours." He smirked, regaining his false confidence. "Yes, it is. And I am going to live in it very comfortably." I let out a soft, dark laugh that echoed down the empty corridor. "You really are a terrible lawyer, Julian. You should have investigated my finances before you drafted these papers. But you were too busy listening to your mother's delusions. I gave you the townhouse. But let us see how you managed to pay that massive mortgage when your mother's law firm goes completely under." Julian stood completely frozen in the middle of the hallway. The smug expression of victory that had just been plastered across his face melted away instantly, replaced by a look of profound confusion and rising panic. He looked down at the signed divorce papers in his hand, and then back up at me. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was trying to process what I had just said about his mother and her prestigious law firm going completely under. For a man who had spent his entire life relying on his family wealth as a safety net, the mere suggestion of financial ruin was completely paralyzing. "Are you crazy?" Julian finally hissed, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "My mother runs one of the most successful corporate firms in Chicago. We are having a minor cash flow issue this quarter because of a delayed settlement. It is temporary. You are just being spiteful because you have absolutely nothing to your name and you know I am about to take the only valuable asset you have left." I did not flinch. I just looked at him with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. I realized in that moment just how deeply Vivian had brainwashed her own children. She had kept them completely in the dark about the massive mountains of debt she was accumulating to maintain their lavish lifestyle. Julian genuinely believed he was the heir to a massive fortune. He had no idea he was actually inheriting a sinking ship made of maxed-out credit lines and overdue commercial loans. "Whatever helps you sleep at night, Julian," I replied softly. "Now, if you will excuse me, I am going to go collect my coat." I turned my back on him and started walking down the long corridor toward the coat check. I heard Julian scramble behind me. He did not follow me. Instead, I heard the heavy oak doors of the private dining room burst open and slam shut again, as he rushed back inside to tell his mother exactly what I had just said. I kept walking, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. I did not even make it halfway down the hallway before I heard the sharp, aggressive sound of Vivian marching out of the dining room. "Zoe!" Vivian barked, her voice echoing loudly off the mahogany walls. I stopped and slowly turned around. Vivian was storming toward me with a look of absolute murderous rage on her face. Julian was trailing a few steps behind her, looking pale and completely out of his depth. Vivian closed the distance between us in seconds. She did not care that we were in a public hallway of one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. She stopped so close to me that I could smell the expensive gin on her breath. "What exactly did you just say to my son?" Vivian demanded in a vicious, breathy whisper. Her eyes were wide and wild, completely stripping away the polished, dignified facade she normally presented to the world. I simply smiled politely. "I told him the truth, Vivian. I told him he should be very careful about taking on a massive mortgage right now, considering the current state of your firm." Vivian reached out and grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging sharply through the fabric of my dress. "How dare you speak about my business?" she snarled. "You know absolutely nothing about corporate finance or how real wealth operates. My family has been at the pinnacle of the Chicago elite for 3 generations. We are legacy members of the most exclusive social clubs in this country. My grandfather built a real estate empire, while your grandfather was probably sweeping floors on the South Side. Do you honestly think a pathetic little girl who grew up sharing hand-me-down clothes is going to stand in a hallway and lecture me about money? I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, and then looked back up at her face. "Remove your hand, Vivian," I said evenly. She did not let go. Instead, she squeezed tighter, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated spite. "You think because you started some ridiculous little lotion company, you can suddenly sit at the big table?" Vivian continued, her voice dripping with venom. "You are nothing, Zoe. You are a charity case that my son took pity on. And now that he is finally done with you, I am going to make sure you leave this family with exactly what you came with. Absolutely nothing. I am going to use every single connection I have in the legal community to ensure you are completely buried in family court. I will freeze your meager bank accounts. I will drag your little startup through endless litigation until you are forced to file for bankruptcy. You will be back living in a cramped apartment on the South Side before the spring, begging for a job as a lab assistant." Julian stepped forward, finding his false courage now that he was hiding safely behind his mother. "You should have just left quietly, Zoe," he added, pointing a finger at me. "You just had to open your mouth and make things worse for yourself." I let out a long, slow breath. I was entirely done playing games with these people. I reached out and firmly pried Vivian's fingers off my arm, pushing her hand away with enough force to make her stumble back half a step. She looked completely shocked that I had dared to touch her. "Your grandfather might have built a real estate empire, Vivian," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, clinical tone. "But you are the one who completely squandered it." Vivian's mouth dropped open. "How dare you?" she gasped. I did not let her finish. I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress. I bypassed my phone and pulled out a single precisely folded piece of heavy paper. I held it between my fingers for a moment, letting the suspense hang heavily in the air. "You talk a lot about your legacy, Vivian," I continued, taking a slow step toward her. "You love to throw around your country club memberships and your prestigious family name. You look down on me because I came from a working-class neighborhood. But the difference between us is that I actually own everything I have. I built my company with my own bare hands. I have zero debt. You, on the other hand, are a complete and utter fraud. You are suffocating under the weight of your own expensive lies." I unfolded the paper and held it up right in front of her face. It was an official receipt from the Cook County treasurer. Vivian's eyes darted down to the paper. The moment she recognized the official county seal printed at the top, the color completely drained from her face. She looked like she had just seen a ghost. Her confident, aggressive posture instantly collapsed. "What is that?" Julian asked, stepping forward and trying to read the paper over his mother's shoulder. "This, Julian," I said loudly and clearly, making sure he heard every single word, "is the property tax receipt for your mother's massive historic estate in Highland Park. The estate she is always bragging about at dinner parties. The estate that proves she is old money." I turned my gaze back to Vivian, who was now trembling visibly. "Tell him, Vivian," I challenged her. "Tell your golden boy why I am holding the tax receipt for your primary residence." Vivian opened her mouth, but she could not speak. She was completely paralyzed by the sudden brutal exposure of her deepest, darkest secret. "Since she is suddenly speechless, I will explain it to you, Julian," I said, keeping my eyes locked on Vivian. "Your mother has not paid the property taxes on that massive house for the last 3 years. She has been taking out secret secondary mortgages just to cover the operational costs of her failing law firm and to fund your sister's lavish lifestyle. The county sent a final notice of delinquency last month. The house was scheduled to be put up for a public tax auction next Tuesday. Everyone at your precious Jack and Jill Country Club was going to find out that the great Vivian was completely broke and about to be evicted." Julian stared at his mother in absolute horror. "Mother," he whispered, "is this true?" Vivian could not look at him. She stared at the receipt in my hand, tears of sheer panic welling up in her eyes. I lowered the paper. I did not want her to lose the house right before the holidays. I continued, my voice dripping with lethal sarcasm. I knew how much appearances meant to this family. So yesterday morning, I went down to the county office and I paid the entire overdue balance in full, $240,000, in cash. I stepped closer to Vivian, invading her personal space, letting her feel the absolute weight of my power. You just called me a charity case, Vivian. But right now, the only reason you have a roof over your head is because the pathetic little girl from the South Side decided to pay your bills. You do not own that legacy anymore. I do. Vivian let out a shaky, strangled gasp. You are lying, she stammered, though her trembling hands and terrified eyes proved she knew it was the absolute truth. You do not have that kind of money. Your startup is failing. You are just trying to manipulate my son. I folded the receipt and slipped it casually back into my pocket. I am not trying to manipulate anyone, Vivian. I am simply pulling back the curtain. You just forced your son to divorce a woman who could have easily saved your entire crumbling empire. But instead of showing gratitude, you decided to humiliate me over an $8,000 dinner bill that you cannot even afford to pay yourself. I looked at Julian, who was currently leaning against the mahogany wall, looking like he was about to physically be sick. His entire worldview was collapsing in real time. He had given up his marriage for a piece of real estate, only to find out his family was entirely bankrupt. Good luck with the partnership, buy-in, Julian, said softly. I am sure the banks will be thrilled to extend you a massive loan once they realize your mother's firm is drowning in toxic debt. I turned away from them and began walking toward the coat check once again. I felt incredibly light. The heavy, suffocating burden of trying to appease this toxic family was permanently gone. I had dropped the first major bomb, but I knew Vivian was not going to surrender quietly. A desperate woman backed into a corner was the most dangerous kind of enemy. She was going to try to destroy me before the truth about her finances could leak out to her social circle. I reached the coat check counter and handed my ticket to the attendant, mentally preparing myself for the absolute chaos that was about to unfold in the next few minutes. I knew exactly what she would do next. I retrieved my wool cashmere coat from the terrified attendant behind the mahogany counter. The poor girl had clearly heard the raised voices echoing down the hallway and was trying her best to remain completely invisible. I slipped my arms into the coat, feeling the luxurious weight of the fabric settle over my shoulders. I was ready to walk out into the freezing Chicago night and leave this toxic family to drown in their own self-made destruction. But Vivian was not about to let me walk away. A woman who has built her entire identity on a mountain of lies will always choose to burn the world down before she lets anyone see her true reflection. I heard the sharp clicking of her heels rushing back down the hallway. I turned around just in time to see Vivian storming toward the coat check area with her cell phone raised. Her face was flushed with a terrifying mixture of absolute panic and pure vindictive rage. She was no longer just trying to put me in my place. She was trying to completely obliterate me. She needed to discredit me so thoroughly that if I ever mentioned her unpaid property taxes or her failing law firm to anyone in her elite social circle, I would look like a deranged, bitter ex-wife making up malicious lies. Vivian did not dial the standard emergency dispatch line. She dialed a secret direct number. She was a senior partner at a prominent corporate law firm, and over the decades she had cultivated deep transactional relationships with several high-ranking officers in the Chicago Police Department. She knew exactly who to call to get an immediate, overwhelming response. Chief Miller Vivian cried out into the phone. Her voice had completely transformed into sheer absolute terror. The vicious, snarling tone she had just used with me was instantly replaced by the breathless, terrified trembling of a helpless victim. It was an absolute masterclass in elite manipulation. I need officers dispatched to the Wellington Steakhouse immediately. Yes, the private dining room. I am being attacked. I stood by the coat check counter and watched her perform. Julian was still standing near the hallway entrance, watching his mother weaponize her connections against the woman he had just divorced. He looked completely numb, too cowardly to stop her, and too shocked by his own financial ruin to participate. It is my former daughter-in-law. Vivian continued, her voice echoing loudly in the elegant foyer. Her name is Zoe Hayes. She is acting completely erratic and violent. She has been drinking heavily and she just tried to physically assault me in the hallway. She is totally out of control. She is a known fraudster who just tried to skip out on an $8,500 dinner bill, and when my son confronted her about it, she completely lost her mind. She is screaming threats about destroying my business and my property. Please, you have to send someone quickly before she hurts my family. She paused, listening to the voice on the other end of the line. Yes, she is still here, Vivian confirmed, staring directly at me with eyes full of cold, calculating malice. She is trying to flee the scene right now. Please tell your officers to hurry. She is incredibly unstable. Vivian ended the call and slipped her phone back into her designer purse. She took a deep breath, instantly dropping the terrified victim act, and glared at me with an expression of absolute triumph. You really thought you could threaten my powerful family today? You are a nobody from the South Side. When the police arrive, who do you think they are going to believe? The respected senior partner of a legacy law firm, or the broke, hysterical girl whose credit card just bounced on an $8,000 check? You are going to spend Christmas Eve in a holding cell, and by the time you get out, I will have a restraining order filed against you so fast it will make your head spin. Before I could even respond to her deranged threat, the heavy wooden doors leading to the main dining room swung open. The restaurant manager stepped into the hallway. He was a tall, impeccably groomed man who looked incredibly stressed. He had obviously been alerted to the declined credit card and the subsequent screaming match taking place in his exclusive establishment. He approached us cautiously, his eyes scanning absolutely everything. "Excuse me, ladies," the manager said, keeping his voice carefully modulated to avoid causing a wider scene. "Is everything all right out here?" I was informed there was an issue with the payment for the private room, and now several of our other guests have complained about the shouting. Vivian instantly spun around to face him, effortlessly slipping back into her distressed socialite persona. "Everything is absolutely not all right," she proclaimed loudly. "This woman just committed credit card fraud in your restaurant. She invited my family to a holiday dinner, knowing perfectly well she had no funds to cover the expense. And when we demanded she resolve the issue, she became incredibly violent and threatened me. I have just contacted the police directly. They are on their way right now." The manager looked at me, his expression hardening. Dealing with a declined card was one thing, but dealing with actual violence, Madame, the manager said, addressing me with a stern, icy tone. "I must ask you to remain on the premises until authorities arrive to sort this out. We take theft of services very seriously at the Wellington." "I have absolutely no intention of running away," I replied calmly, adjusting the heavy collar of my wool coat. "I am more than happy to wait for the police to arrive. In fact, I insist on it." My complete lack of fear seemed to unsettle Vivian. She had expected me to panic. She had expected me to beg her to call off the police or to make a desperate dash for the front doors. When I simply stood my ground, her eyes narrowed. She turned toward the private dining room and snapped her fingers. "Darius, Chloe, get out here right now." A few seconds later, Darius and Chloe hurried out into the hallway. Darius was still flushed with anger from my comments about his fake diamond watch, and Chloe looked eager to witness whatever drama her mother was orchestrating. "Do not let her leave," Vivian commanded, pointing a rigid finger directly at me. "The police are on their way. She just tried to physically attack me and she is trying to run out on the bill." Chloe let out a dramatic gasp, immediately playing along with the vicious narrative. "Oh my God, Zoe," Chloe shrieked, clutching her pearl necklace. "Are you completely insane? You cannot just attack our mother because you are broke and jealous." Darius saw an opportunity to regain the fragile masculinity he had lost inside the dining room. He puffed out his chest and marched straight toward me, using his heavy, muscular frame to completely block my path to the exit. He stood inches away from me, glaring down aggressively. "You are not going anywhere, you crazy piece of trash," Darius growled. "You are going to sit here and wait for the cops. And when they get here, I am personally going to press charges against you for threatening my family. You messed with the wrong people tonight. They were boxing me in." Darius stood firmly blocking the front exit. Chloe moved to stand right beside him, her arms crossed defensively. Vivian stood beside the restaurant manager, acting like a traumatized victim requiring protection. And Julian remained pressed against the wall, silently watching his family unlawfully detain me in the hallway of a restaurant. It was a perfectly executed ambush. They were using their sheer numbers, loud voices, and their polished upper-class appearances to completely control the narrative. To the restaurant manager and to anyone else watching from a distance, I looked exactly like an aggressive, erratic, dangerous criminal. But I was not any other woman. I had handled ruthless venture capitalists. I knew how to handle bullies. You let them overplay their hand until they completely destroy themselves. I looked at Darius trying to look menacing. I looked at Chloe vibrating with malicious excitement. I looked at Vivian smiling with cold, triumphant certainty. And I looked at Julian, the cowardly little boy about to lose absolutely everything. I simply offered them another slow, chilling smile. "You want me to wait for the police?" I asked softly, making sure my voice carried. "That sounds wonderful." I turned my back entirely on Darius and Chloe. I walked slowly past Vivian and the confused manager, pushing open the heavy oak doors, and walked right back into the private dining room. I went to the head of the table, pulled the mahogany chair out, and sat down. I crossed my legs, waiting. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind me as the rest of the family filtered back into the private dining room. They looked like a pack of confused wolves, unsure of what to do with a prey that refused to run. I smoothed the fabric of my dress and rested my hands gracefully on my lap. Vivian marched in right behind me, her chest heaving with indignation. She stood at the opposite end of the long table, gripping the back of a chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was furious that I was not cowering in the hallway, begging for mercy. Darius strutted in next, his chest puffed out, acting as though he had just won a physical altercation. Chloe followed closely on his heels, her phone already in her hand, probably texting her friends about the drama. Finally, Julian slipped through the doors. He looked completely defeated, choosing a seat at the far corner of the table, putting as much physical distance between us as possible. He stared blankly at the scattered remains of my purse that Vivian had dumped earlier. I sat in absolute silence, letting the tension in the room thicken until it was practically suffocating. Darius could not handle the quiet. He needed constant validation and noise to feel important. He looked at me sitting calmly at the head of the table, and his face twisted into a nasty sneer. "You think you are so smart," Zoe Darius said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think just because you paid off a tax bill you are suddenly untouchable. You do not understand how real power works in this city. You are just a tourist playing in a world you do not belong in." I did not respond. I just tilted my head slightly, watching him perform. Darius pulled his phone out of his pocket. He wanted to completely humiliate me. He wanted to show Vivian that he was the ruthless businessman she always wanted her son to be. "I am going to show you what happens when you disrespect my family," Darius announced. He scrolled through his contacts and pressed the call button, putting the phone on speaker so everyone in the room could hear his grand display of power. It rang twice before a man answered. "Hey, Dee," the voice on the other end said, sounding incredibly eager to please. "Marcus, my man," Darius replied smoothly, projecting his voice loudly. "Listen, I need a massive favor right now. I have a situation with a fraudulent individual trying to pull a scam on my family. She just tried to pass a bad card at the Wellington and is acting completely unhinged. I need you to go into the system and flag her social security number for severe financial fraud. Put her on the absolute highest risk tier. I want her blacklisted from every major institution by tomorrow morning." There was a slight pause on the other end. "You got it," D. Marcus said confidently. "Just give me the details. I will put a hard freeze on her profile across the entire network. She will not be able to open a savings account at a credit union when I am done with this." Darius looked right at me, his eyes wide with malicious glee. He recited my full legal name, my date of birth, and my social security number from memory, having clearly snooped through Julian's home office files at some point. I felt a brief flash of disgust that my husband had been so careless with my personal information, but it quickly faded into amusement. Darius honestly thought he was destroying my life. "Consider it done," Marcus confirmed over the speaker. "The fraud alert is processing now. Anyone running her name will see a massive red flag." "Thanks, Marcus," Darius said, hanging up the phone with a dramatic flourish. He slammed the phone down on the table and leaned forward, bracing his hands on the mahogany surface. "There you go, Zoe," he gloated. "You are officially financially dead. You will never get a business loan for that pathetic little lotion company of yours ever again. You will not be able to rent an apartment, lease a car, or even get a basic credit card. By the time the police are done with you tonight, You will be entirely bankrupt and totally blacklisted. Welcome back to the bottom of the barrel. Chloe giggled, clapping her hands together in sheer delight. Oh my God, babe, that was absolutely ruthless. She praised him, looking at her husband like he was a conquering hero. She is going to have to live in a homeless shelter. Vivian stood up straighter, her face glowing with immense pride. She looked at Darius with the kind of deep, genuine admiration she had never once directed toward her own son. She slowly began to clap her hands. That was brilliantly executed, Darius. Vivian declared, her voice filled with profound respect. That is exactly how you handle a liability. You cut them off at the root so they can never grow back. You are a true businessman. You understand the necessity of being utterly merciless when the family legacy is threatened. Vivian then turned her gaze toward Julian. The look of pride instantly vanished, replaced by a sneer of absolute, unadulterated disgust. She looked at her son as if he were a stain on the expensive rug. Look at him, Vivian spat, gesturing wildly toward Julian, who was shrinking further and further into his chair. Look at my own flesh and blood. A coward, a weak, pathetic disappointment of a man. Your wife stands in a hallway and threatens my entire legacy, and you do absolutely nothing. You let Darius do the heavy lifting because you do not have the spine to protect your own mother. Julian looked down at his lap, his face burning bright red. Mother, please, he whispered, his voice cracking. I got her to sign the divorce papers just like you wanted. I did what you asked. You did the bare minimum, Julian. Vivian shouted, her voice echoing harshly in the confined space. You brought this trash into our family. You allowed her to embarrass us. And when it was time to put her in her place, you hid in the corner while your brother-in-law handled it. Darius is the son I always wanted. He is decisive. He is powerful. He operates on a level you will never be able to comprehend. You are just a glorified paralegal coasting on my last name. The absolute cruelty of her words hung heavily in the air. Julian looked completely shattered. He had spent his entire life bending over backwards to please a woman who fundamentally despised him. He had betrayed his wife, stolen her money, and handed her divorce papers on Christmas Eve, all to earn a single scrap of approval from his mother. And in the end, she cast him aside the moment someone louder and more aggressive entered the room. He was finally realizing that he had sacrificed the only person who actually loved him for a family that viewed him as entirely disposable. I sat quietly watching the miserable dynamic unfold. I did not feel bad for Julian. He had made his choices. But I was getting tired of listening to Darius breathe. The man was so incredibly arrogant, completely oblivious to the massive trap he was currently standing in. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, checking the time. It was getting late, and I wanted this grand finale to begin. I glanced at my watch, a vintage Cartier piece that Vivian had once mocked as looking too masculine. I slowly lowered my wrist and looked directly at Darius. The smug, victorious smile was still plastered across his face. He really thought he had won. You know, Darius, I said, my voice cutting through the lingering tension in the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. You really should not play with banking regulations over an unsecured phone line, especially when you are already under federal scrutiny. Darius frowned, his thick eyebrows pulling together in confusion. What the hell are you talking about? He snapped, crossing his arms defensively. I leaned back in my chair, resting my elbows on the armrests, and steepled my fingers together. I am talking about your $5 million crypto fund, Darius. The decentralized finance liquidity pool you were just bragging about to Vivian. You claim you secured seed capital from investors in Dubai. You claim you are making astronomical returns month over month, but that is a complete lie, isn't it? Darius's face went completely rigid. Chloe stopped smiling. Vivian looked back and forth between us, entirely unsure of what was happening. Shut up, Zoe. Darius warned, his voice suddenly losing all of its previous bravado. He took a step toward me, but I did not flinch. You did not get money from Dubai. I continued, my voice calm and relentlessly steady. You gathered funds from Vivian's wealthy friends at the Jack and Jill Country Club. You promised them massive returns in a completely unregulated market. And then you funneled that money into a series of offshore crypto wallets to hide your catastrophic trading losses. You have been moving new investor money to pay off the old investors just to keep the illusion alive. It is a classic Ponzi scheme, Darius, and it is entirely falling apart. You are out of your mind, Darius shouted, though a noticeable bead of sweat had just formed on his forehead. You do not know anything about my business. You are just throwing out big words to sound smart. I know that the Securities and Exchange Commission opened a formal investigation into your primary wallet addresses 3 weeks ago. I stated simply, watching his eyes widen in absolute horror. I know that your main liquidity provider froze your accounts yesterday afternoon. And I know that the buddy you just called on the phone, Marcus from First Chicago Trust, is currently under investigation for accepting kickbacks to hide your fraudulent wire transfers. The room went completely dead silent. Darius stared at me, his jaw practically hitting the floor. He could not comprehend how I knew these details. He had kept his financial ruin, a closely guarded secret, completely terrified of the moment the house of cards would finally collapse. How do you know that? Darius whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. I smiled, the same chilling, calculated smile from earlier. Because, Darius, when you run a highly successful biotech firm, you have to employ a very talented team of forensic accountants to conduct due diligence on potential partners. And when my husband started acting erratically this month, I had my team do a deep dive into the finances of everyone sitting at this table. You thought I was financially dead, but you are the one who is about to face federal prison time. I stood up slowly from my chair, keeping my eyes locked on his terrified face. I smoothed the front of my coat and took a single step toward him. Your little phone call to Marcus did not do anything but provide a recorded confession of conspiracy to commit financial fraud. The federal authorities monitor his lines. Darius stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the dining table. The expensive silverware rattled against the plates. He looked at Chloe, who was staring at him with wide, completely horrified eyes. He had nothing left to say. His entire fake empire was crumbling right in front of him. I simply checked my watch again, waiting for the real authorities to finally arrive and finish the job. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open for the third time that evening, but this time it was not the waiter or the restaurant manager returning to negotiate the bill. Two uniformed Chicago police officers stepped into the room. Their heavy-duty boots thudded against the polished hardwood floor, a harsh and completely jarring sound, in the middle of the elegant Wellington steakhouse. The officers looked around the room, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts. They took in the chaotic scene of the scattered takeout boxes, the half-empty wine bottles, and the incredibly tense posture of everyone standing around the mahogany table. The sudden arrival of law enforcement instantly shattered the quiet terror that had just completely paralyzed Darius. He quickly backed away from me, melting into the shadows near the corner of the room, desperately hoping the police were not here for his offshore crypto fraud. But Vivian did not shrink back. The moment the officer stepped through the door, she completely transformed. It was an absolute masterclass in elite manipulation. The vicious, snarling woman who had just been threatening to ruin my life in the hallway completely vanished. In her place stood a fragile, deeply traumatized society matron who had just been subjected to the most horrific ordeal of her entire life. Vivian let out a shaky, dramatic gasp and rushed toward the older of the two officers. She reached out with trembling hands, clutching her vintage pearl necklace as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. "Oh, thank God, you are here," Vivian cried, her voice cracking with perfectly manufactured emotion. "Officer, please, you have to help us. We are absolutely terrified." The older officer, a burly man with a thick mustache and a shiny silver name tag that read Officer Harrison, immediately softened his posture. He looked at Vivian's expensive tailored crimson dress, the genuine pearls, and the undeniable aura of old money privilege she projected so effortlessly. He was completely conditioned to defer to wealth and status. "Ma'am, are you the one who called in the disturbance?" Officer Harrison asked respectfully. "Yes," Vivian whimpered, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "It is her, my former daughter-in-law. She is completely out of control. We invited her to our family holiday dinner out of the goodness of our hearts, even though she has a history of severe financial instability and mental episodes. She insisted on paying the bill to prove she was doing well. But when the waiter brought the check, her card declined, and when my son asked her about it, she completely snapped. Vivian paused to wipe a fake tear from the corner of her eye, ensuring she did not smudge her perfect makeup. She started screaming at us. Vivian continued, her voice trembling beautifully. She threatened to destroy my business. She threatened to take my home. And when I tried to leave the room to get the manager, she followed me into the hallway and physically assaulted me. She grabbed my arm and tried to push me to the ground. My son-in-law had to physically block the door just to keep her away from me. I was terrified she had a weapon in her purse. The younger officer, a tall man with a severe buzz cut, immediately turned his aggressive glare toward me. He rested his hand on his handcuffs. "Is this true?" he barked, not even addressing me as a human being, just treating me as an immediate threat, based entirely on Vivian's theatrical performance. I remained seated at the head of the table. I kept my legs crossed and my hands resting calmly on my lap. I did not touch Vivian. I stated clearly, my voice completely level. We had a verbal disagreement in the hallway about her unpaid property taxes. There was no physical altercation. If you would like, you can ask the restaurant manager to review the security footage in the corridor. It will show her grabbing my arm, not the other way around. Vivian let out another loud gasp. "She is lying!" Vivian shrieked. "She is a desperate broke fraudster. Just ask the manager about the bill." The restaurant manager, who had followed the police into the room, stepped forward nervously. He cleared his throat and looked apologetically at the officers. "It is true about the bill, officers," the manager confirmed. "The total is $8,542. The young woman presented a business debit card, but it was heavily declined by the issuing bank. When I informed the party, a loud altercation broke out. "We just want the bill settled and the disturbance removed from our restaurant." Officer Harrison nodded solemnly, taking the manager's statement as absolute proof that Vivian's entire fabricated story was the gospel truth. He walked slowly around the long dining table, approaching me with the heavy, intimidating stride of a man who had already decided I was guilty. He looked down at me, sitting in the chair, his eyes scanning my clothing, completely unimpressed by my calm demeanor. He saw a young black woman from the South Side sitting in a chair she clearly could not afford, surrounded by wealthy people who wanted her gone. The bias was palpable. "Stand up," Officer Harrison commanded harshly. I slowly stood up, smoothing the front of my dress. I looked him directly in the eye, refusing to be intimidated by his badge or his aggressive tone. "Let me see your identification right now," he demanded, holding his hand out expectantly. I reached into my purse, which Julian had thankfully left resting on a side table after Vivian had dumped it earlier. I pulled out my Illinois driver license and handed it over to him. He snatched it from my fingers and scrutinized it closely, shining a small tactical flashlight on the surface as if he expected it to be a cheap counterfeit. "Zoe Hayes," he read aloud, his tone dripping with intense skepticism. "Well, Zoe, you are in a lot of trouble tonight. You cannot just walk into a fine dining establishment, rack up an $8,000 bill, and then pass a bad card. That is theft of services. It is a serious crime. And if this lady wants to press charges for assault, you are looking at a very long weekend in lockup." "I did not pass a bad card," I explained patiently, though I knew he was not really listening to me. "The funds are in my account. There was simply a security freeze placed on the card by my bank due to a massive incoming wire transfer. If you give me a moment to contact my financial institution, this can all be resolved immediately." Darius let out a loud, mocking snort from his dark corner. "Do not listen to her, officer!" Darius called out, trying to regain some of his lost bravado now that the police were focusing their anger on me. "She does not have a dime to her name. Her business is completely bankrupt. She is just stalling because she knows she is caught." Chloe chimed in, nodding vigorously. "She has been lying to our family for years about being a successful CEO. She is completely delusional." Officer Harrison handed my license to his younger partner, who began calling my information into dispatch over his shoulder radio. "Look," Lady Officer Harrison said, leaning in closer to me, attempting to use his physical size to force me into submission. I have been doing this job for 20 years. I know a scam artist when I see one. You come in here trying to play the big shot, treating your wealthy family to a dinner you know you cannot afford, and when you get caught, you start throwing a temper tantrum and assaulting senior citizens. He pointed a thick finger at my chest. I need to see proof that you have a single dollar to your name right now. Pull up your banking app. Show me the available balance. Because if you cannot prove that you have the capital to cover this restaurant bill this exact second, I am putting you in handcuffs and dragging you out of here through the front lobby in front of everyone. I stared at him, feeling the absolute absurdity of the situation. An armed police officer was demanding to see my private banking information to satisfy the petty grievances of my abusive mother-in-law. I looked past him and saw Vivian smiling. It was a wicked, triumphant smile. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully weaponized the police to strip away my dignity and throw me in a cage, just for daring to expose her financial ruin. Julian was still sitting in the corner staring at the floor. He heard the officer threaten to arrest his wife, the woman he had spent 5 years with, and he did not say a single word. He was completely comfortable letting me take the fall for a bill he had stolen the cash for. I am not going to show you my private banking application on my personal phone. Without a warrant, I told Officer Harrison, my voice completely steady and unyielding. That is a massive violation of my privacy and completely outside the scope of your authority. The restaurant has my card. The payment will clear. Officer Harrison's face flushed with violent anger. He did not like being told no. He did not like that I was not crying or begging for mercy. You want to play hardball? He growled, stepping completely into my personal space. Fine. You are under arrest for theft of services. He reached around to the back of his heavy leather utility belt. I heard the sharp metallic clinking sound of metal hitting metal as he unclasped his handcuffs. Vivian's smile grew wider. Chloe pulled out her phone, holding it up slightly clearly, preparing to record a video of me being hauled away in chains so she could send it to her country club friends. Darius stepped out of the shadows, looking absolutely thrilled. Put your hands behind your back, the officer ordered, grabbing my left wrist with a rough, unforgiving grip. I did not resist his physical hold, but I did not comply with his order to turn around. I stood my ground, my heart beating with a slow, powerful rhythm. This was the exact moment they had all been waiting for. The complete and total destruction of Zoe Hayes. But right as Officer Harrison raised the silver metal cuffs toward my wrists, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the tense silence of the dining room. It was my cell phone. The phone was sitting face up on the center of the mahogany dining table, right next to the scattered remains of my spilled purse. The screen suddenly lit up, illuminating the dark wood surface. The ringtone was loud, echoing off the expensive paneled walls. Every single person in the room froze. Officer Harrison paused, the handcuffs dangling mid-air, his eyes darting toward the glowing screen. Vivian stopped smiling, annoyed by the sudden interruption to her grand victory. Darius and Chloe leaned forward, their eyes squinting to read the caller ID. The words flashing brightly across the large screen were impossible to miss. The text was bold and glaringly obvious, demanding the attention of every single person standing in that room. Executive Director, J.P. Morgan Chase. I looked down at the phone, and then I slowly looked up at Officer Harrison. The absolute confusion on his face was incredibly satisfying. I gently pulled my wrist out of his loosened grip. I believe I need to take this call, officer, I said softly. It seems my financial institution is finally reaching out to resolve the issue. I reached out and tapped the glowing green button on the screen. Before anyone could utter another word, I adjusted the volume dial on the side of the phone, pushing it all the way to maximum. I tapped the speaker icon, ensuring that the voice on the other end would project loudly and clearly across the entire private dining room. The room was so quiet that you could hear the soft humming of the ventilation system overhead. Hello, I said calmly, keeping my eyes fixed entirely on Officer Harrison. This is Zoe Hayes speaking. Who is calling me right now? The male voice boomed through the speaker. It was not the automated recording of a customer service line, and it was certainly not the tone of a collections agent. It was the frantic, deeply apologetic, and highly polished voice of a senior banking executive who knew he was speaking to someone of immense importance. Ms. Hayes, the voice rang out, echoing off the mahogany walls. This is Richard Sterling, Executive Director of Private Wealth Management at JP Morgan Chase. I am calling you directly tonight because I was just alerted to an automated security trigger on your standard debit card. I am so incredibly sorry for any inconvenience this may have caused you this evening. Richard continued, his tone practically vibrating with professional anxiety. I watched Officer Harrison process this. The deep scowl that had been etched into his features began to falter. He slowly lowered the silver handcuffs, though he did not put them away just yet. Vivian scoffed loudly, crossing her arms defensively. She clearly thought this was some sort of elaborate prank, or a desperate stalling tactic I had set up with a friend. She rolled her eyes and looked at the ceiling, completely unaware of reality. Please continue, Richard, I said smoothly. Could you explain to the room exactly why my card was declined at the Wellington Steakhouse tonight? I am currently dealing with a slight misunderstanding regarding my ability to cover the bill. Of course, Mrs. Hayes, Richard replied immediately. He wanted to fix this error faster than humanly possible. The automated fraud system locked your card purely as a mandatory security measure. Our algorithms are designed to temporarily freeze all standard accounts when a sudden massive influx of capital is detected. It is an archaic protocol that should have been manually overridden earlier today. I take full personal responsibility for the oversight, Richard promised. Darius let out a short, cynical laugh. A massive influx of capital, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. What did she do, deposit a check for $1,000? Richard did not hear Darius, but he continued his explanation with absolute earth-shattering clarity. When the $1.2 billion wire transfer from El Oriole cleared our institutional servers an hour ago for the total acquisition of your company, Melanix, the algorithms froze your lower-tier accounts to securely upgrade your entire financial profile immediately tonight instead. You have been instantly upgraded to our private wealth tier, Richard finished. The words hit the air like a physical shockwave. $1.2 billion. The entire restaurant dining room went completely terrifyingly dead silent. It was not just a quiet pause. It was the kind of absolute stillness that occurs when reality itself violently fractures and reassembles into something entirely unrecognizable. The heavy silver handcuffs slipped from his strong grip, dangling completely uselessly by his side, the metal clinking softly against his utility belt. His jaw went slack, and he stared at my phone in pure absolute shock. Vivian literally dropped her jaw. The smug, victorious sneer she had worn all evening vanished instantly, completely wiped clean by a level of shock so profound her brain could not even process it. She stared at me, her eyes wide and unblinking, her chest entirely frozen mid-breath. The woman who had spent the last 3 hours mocking my empty wallet and my glorified lotion company was suddenly standing in the presence of a billionaire. A self-made cash liquid billionaire. Darius looked like he had been struck by lightning. The flashy crypto investor was now facing total financial ruin. He had just tried to humiliate me with a single $100 bill, and now he was facing a woman whose net worth eclipsed his entire fraudulent fund by 1,000 times over. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. Chloe dropped her phone. The device hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack, but she did not even flinch. She just stood there with her mouth hanging open, looking back and forth between me and the phone on the table. And then there was Julian. My cowardly husband was now completely, utterly shattered. Julian did not just look shocked. He looked completely and utterly destroyed. His knees physically buckled, forcing him to grab the edge of the dining table just to stay standing. He had demanded our $400,000 townhouse as alimony, completely waiving his right to everything else. He had thrown away $1 billion to appease a mother who was secretly drowning in toxic debt. Richard Sterling continued speaking, completely unaware of the absolute devastation his words were causing in the room. The acquisition funds have been fully authenticated and securely parked in a high-yield holding account today. We will hold them until we can finalize your permanent portfolio allocations, Richard explained, his tone completely deferential. As of this moment, your accounts are fully unrestricted. You have unlimited drawing power on your active cards, and a dedicated team of wealth managers has been assigned to handle your daily operations. Your new Centurion card is being expedited via armored courier as we speak. Again, Ms. Hayes. I cannot apologize enough for the embarrassment this automated freeze may have caused you tonight. I looked around the room, taking in the spectacular canvas of their shattered egos, completely destroyed right now. The restaurant manager was visibly shaking, suddenly realizing he had nearly allowed the Chicago police to arrest one of the wealthiest women in the city over a steak dinner. He looked at Vivian with profound anger, realizing she had completely lied to him and nearly caused a massive public relations disaster for his establishment. The younger police officer slowly took his hand off his radio. He looked at Vivian, then at Darius, and finally back at me. The aggressive, condescending attitude he had walked in with was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, uncomfortable realization of his massive mistake tonight. Officer Harrison cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of professional composure, but he was completely out of his depth. "Thank you, Richard," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and measured. "I appreciate your prompt attention to this matter. Please ensure the hold is entirely lifted across all connected platforms. I have a rather large dinner bill to settle, and I do not want any further interruptions." "It is already done," Ms. Hayes, Richard promised enthusiastically. "Your current card will process any amount you require. Is there absolutely anything else I can do for you this fine evening?" I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the terrified faces of my former family. Vivian was trembling so violently that the expensive pearls around her neck were visibly rattling against her collarbone. Darius looked like he was going to vomit. I smiled a genuine warm smile that did not reach my eyes. "Actually, Richard, there is one more thing," I said softly. "Since I am now officially placed in your private wealth tier, I assume that grants me certain administrative privileges regarding the distressed debt funds your bank manages." "Absolutely," Ms. Hayes, Richard confirmed without a single second of hesitation. "As a Tier 1 client, you have majority voting rights and direct access to our distressed asset portfolios. Our entire financial infrastructure is at your complete disposal. Whatever you need, we will execute immediately." "Perfect," I replied, my eyes locking entirely onto Vivian. "I will be calling you back in about 5 minutes to discuss a specific commercial loan that requires immediate liquidation." "Thank you, Richard. Have a wonderful holiday." I tapped the red button on the screen, ending the call. The silence returned, but this time it was incredibly heavy, practically suffocating everyone in the room except me tonight. The reality of the $1.2 billion buyout was settling into their bones. Melanix was not a little lotion company. It was not a charity project or a failing startup. It was an industry-disrupting juggernaut, and El Oriole had just paid a massive premium to acquire my lifework. I slowly picked up my phone and slipped it back into my purse. I looked at Officer Harrison, who was still standing awkwardly next to my chair, the silver handcuffs now completely hidden behind his back. I smiled warmly and asked if he still wanted me arrested today. Officer Harrison took a massive step backward. He looked at me as if I had suddenly transformed into a completely different species. "No, ma'am." He stammered, his voice entirely stripped of its previous aggressive authority. "We absolutely do not need to make any arrests today. It is clearly a simple misunderstanding regarding the banking system. We apologize for the intrusion." The younger officer was already backing toward the heavy oak doors, desperately wanting to escape the catastrophic legal liability they had almost stepped into. Arresting a newly minted billionaire on completely false charges pushed by a bitter mother-in-law would have ended their police careers permanently. They knew Vivian had manipulated them, and they wanted nothing more to do with her twisted family dynamics. Before Officer Harrison could offer another pathetic, groveling apology, my phone buzzed sharply in my palm. The glass screen illuminated once again. It was Richard Sterling calling back immediately. I slid my finger across the glass to answer, putting him straight back on speaker mode for the entire room to hear. "Ms. Hayes." Richard said, his voice sounding slightly out of breath from rushing. "I apologize for calling right back so abruptly. You mentioned the distressed debt portfolio just before we disconnected. As part of your immediate onboarding protocol into the private wealth tier, I am legally required to formally inform you that your new account status grants you absolute majority voting rights over our entire distressed commercial debt fund. Because your capital injection is so massive, you effectively own the controlling interest. You do not even need to wait 5 minutes to call me back to discuss liquidations. I took the liberty of pulling up the master ledger on my terminal the second you mentioned it. You can make executive decisions right now over the phone, and I will execute them immediately. I smiled. That was significantly better than I had initially anticipated. The universe was handing me the perfect weapon on a silver platter. I walked slowly around the large dining table, my high heels clicking rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. I left the two police officers standing awkwardly near the entrance completely forgotten. I stopped right next to Vivian. She was gripping the edge of the mahogany table so tightly that her knuckles were completely white. The confident, wealthy matriarch facade she had worn for decades was entirely gone, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She looked exactly like a terrified, trapped animal realizing the hunter had finally cornered her. The heavy silence in the private dining room amplified the sound of her ragged, uneven breathing. "Tell me, Director," I said into the phone, keeping my eyes locked intensely on Vivian. "Does that specific distressed asset fund happen to hold the $10 million commercial line of credit for the law firm of Vivian and Partners?" Vivian flinched as if I had just physically struck her across the face. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to beg, or to issue another empty threat, but no sound came out. Her throat was completely dry. Julian let out a pathetic whimper from the corner of the room. He was finally starting to understand the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic mistake he had made tonight. He had handed me divorce papers to protect this very law firm, completely unaware that I was about to become the person who literally owned its survival. I heard the rapid clicking of a computer keyboard coming through the speaker of my phone as Richard typed the name into his search database. "Yes, Ms. Hayes," Richard confirmed a few seconds later, his professional tone cutting through the thick tension in the room. "We do indeed hold that specific commercial note. It was transferred into the distressed fund earlier this year due to severe non-payment issues." Looking at the current ledger, the law firm of Vivian and Partners has a principal balance of $10.4 million. Furthermore, I can see that the account is currently 90 days past due on its minimum interest payments. They are in flagrant violation of their financial covenants. The underwriting department flagged it for potential default proceedings last month, but no executive action has been taken yet. 90 days past due. I repeated the words slowly, letting them echo across the elegant private dining room. I looked down at Vivian. Her perfect, expensive makeup could not hide the sickly gray pallor that had completely taken over her face. She was completely bankrupt. Her entire legacy, her country club memberships, her snobbish attitude toward my working-class background. It was all funded by toxic debt she could not even afford to service. She had spent the entire evening mocking my empty wallet, dumping my cheap lip gloss and public transit card onto the table, trying to prove I was inferior. And all the while she was millions of dollars in the red, drowning in a financial hole she could never escape. "You are a complete fraud, Vivian," I whispered, though in the dead silence of the room my voice carried perfectly to every single corner. "You look down on people who actually work for a living, but you are nothing more than a parasite living on borrowed money. You built an entire kingdom out of maxed-out credit lines and unpaid property taxes. And then you had the absolute audacity to call the police on me tonight. You tried to have me arrested and thrown in a cage just to protect your pathetic ego. You thought you could completely crush me because you thought I was poor. But you picked a fight with the wrong woman on the wrong night." Vivian finally found her voice, though it was nothing more than a broken, desperate rasp. "Zoe, please," Vivian pleaded, tears of genuine panic finally spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her pristine mascara. "Please do not do this. I built that firm from the ground up. It is my entire life. It is Julian's future. You cannot just destroy our family legacy over a silly misunderstanding at dinner." I was just stressed. "I did not mean any of the things I said to you tonight. We are family, Zoe. Please, we can work this out privately. I will apologize to the police. I will pay the restaurant bill myself. Just tell the bank to give us a little more time to gather the capital." I looked at Julian. My coward of a husband was still clutching the edge of the table, looking at me with wide, completely terrified eyes. He had wanted the townhouse. He had wanted me gone so he could step up as a junior partner at his mother's firm. Now there was no firm left to inherit. There was no legacy. There was only the crushing weight of reality. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy for either of them. They had pushed me to the absolute edge, expecting me to fall. Instead, I learned how to fly, and I was going to drop them from the highest possible altitude. I turned my attention back to the phone glowing brightly in my hand. "Richard," I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or mercy. "Yes, Ms. Hayes," he replied instantly, ready to execute my commands. "I am exercising my majority voting rights on the distressed debt portfolio right now." I instructed clearly, ensuring the police officers heard every single word of my legal corporate directive. "I want you to officially declare the Vivian and Partners commercial loan in complete default. Initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings on her law firm tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock. Freeze all of their operational accounts. Do not give them a single minute of grace period." "Understood, Ms. Hayes," Richard confirmed efficiently. "The foreclosure paperwork will be filed with the courts the moment the financial district opens tomorrow morning. Is there anything else regarding this specific account?" "Yes," I added, delivering the absolute final fatal blow to Vivian's fake empire. "She secured that commercial loan using personal assets. I want you to formally seize her private historic estate in Highland Park as collateral for the unpaid debt. Lock the gates and begin the eviction process immediately." The exact moment the words left my mouth, Vivian let out a horrifying, guttural shriek. Her legs completely gave out beneath her. She collapsed heavily back into the large mahogany dining chair, her hands clutching desperately at her chest. She began to hyperventilate, gasping violently for air as the sheer magnitude of her total destruction finally crushed her. Her firm was gone. Her historic mansion was gone. Her fake wealth was entirely eradicated. She was left with absolutely nothing but the cold, bitter reality of her own terrible making. The entire restaurant staff watched silently from the hallway. Darius stared blankly. My vengeance was fully realized. I breathed out a long sigh of utter relief, knowing my brilliant future was totally secured and completely free from them. The sound of Vivian sobbing uncontrollably into her hands was the only noise filling the private dining room. She was entirely broken. But while she mourned the death of her illusions, the rat in the corner was already trying to figure out a way to survive the sinking ship. Darius slowly stepped out of the shadows, his fake diamond watch catching the light of the chandelier overhead. He ran a trembling hand over his slicked-back hair and desperately adjusted the lapels of his overly tight suit jacket. He looked at Vivian with a brief flash of utter disgust before turning his attention entirely to me. He forced a wide, completely unconvincing smile onto his sweaty face. "Zoe," Darius said, his voice entirely stripped of the arrogant condescension he had used just 20 minutes ago. It was replaced by the smooth, oily tone of a desperate salesman scrambling for a lifeline. "That was an absolutely brilliant play. I have to admit, I did not see that coming at all. You really played your cards close to the chest. $1.2 billion. That is massive league territory." He took a few slow steps toward me, holding his hands up in a placating gesture, as if we were suddenly old friends sharing a private inside joke. "I always knew you had serious potential." Darius lied smoothly, completely ignoring the fact that he had just offered me $20 an hour to scrub his executive toilets. We are operating on a completely different level than the rest of these people in this room. We understand the ruthless nature of high finance." Vivian got incredibly sloppy with her leverage. She let emotion dictate her business. "But you and I are sharks. We are fellow investors now. We should really sit down next week and discuss some strategic partnerships. I have some incredible decentralized finance vehicles that could yield you massive returns on that new capital." I stared at him, feeling a wave of intense physical revulsion wash over me. He was actually trying to pivot. He was standing in the middle of a room completely destroyed by my new wealth, watching his mother-in-law hyperventilate over the loss of her entire estate, and his only thought was how he could hustle me for a piece of the pie. I did not smile. I did not entertain his pathetic delusion for a single second. You and I are not fellow investors, Darius, I said, my voice dropping to a low lethal register. I am a billionaire who built a legitimate biotechnology empire that actually helps people. You are a common street hustler wearing a fake Audemars Piguet who steals money from gullible country club members. We are not the same species. Darius's oily smile faltered, but he tried desperately to maintain his composure. Come on, Zoe. He chuckled nervously, glancing quickly at the two police officers who were still standing near the door, watching the entire exchange with immense fascination. Do not be like that. We had a little misunderstanding earlier, but that is just the nature of the game. We are family. We are absolutely not family, I fired back, stepping closer to him so he had to look me directly in the eyes. And since you are so eager to discuss high finance in front of an audience, let us talk about your liquidity pool. I turned my head slightly, directing my voice toward Officer Harrison and his younger partner. Officers, since you are already here investigating potential financial crimes, you might want to take a very close look at the man standing in front of me. His name is Darius Washington. He runs an unregistered cryptocurrency hedge fund operating out of a leased office in the financial district. Officer Harrison perked up, his law enforcement instincts suddenly reignited. He reached for the small notepad tucked into his uniform shirt pocket. "Hey, Darius," shouted his voice, cracking with sudden overwhelming panic. "What are you doing? Shut your mouth, Zoe. You do not know what you are talking about." He claims he secures millions in seed capital from foreign investors in Dubai. I continued, speaking clearly and deliberately so the officers could document every single word. But that is a complete fabrication. He targets the wealthy older friends of his mother-in-law. He leverages Vivian's status at the Jack and Jill Country Club to convince retirees to hand over their life savings. He promises them 20% monthly returns on decentralized finance protocols, but he is not trading anything. Chloe finally moved. She stepped forward, her face pale and streaked with mascara tears. "Zoe, stop it," she pleaded, her voice shaking violently. "You are making things up. Darius is a financial genius. He showed me the portfolio dashboards. We have millions in assets." "He showed you a simulated dashboard, Chloe," I corrected her gently, though I felt no pity for the woman who had laughed at me all night. "The numbers on the screen are entirely fake. Your husband takes the cash from new investors and uses it to pay the fake dividends of the old investors. He skims a massive management fee off the top to pay for his tight suits, his expensive dinners, and your luxury vacations. He is running a textbook Ponzi scheme, and he is entirely insolvent." Darius was sweating profusely now. Large drops of perspiration rolled down his forehead, soaking into his stiff white collar. "You are insane," he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You have absolutely no proof of any of this. You are just a bitter ex-wife trying to cause trouble because you hate my family." "Officers. She is completely unhinged. You need to escort her out of here right now." The officers did not move to escort me anywhere. They stared at Darius completely, recognizing the universal signs of a guilty man, panicking under intense pressure. "I actually have an overwhelming amount of proof," I replied smoothly. "Do you remember when I told you that my forensic accounting team looked into your finances?" They did not just look, Darius, they acted. Darius froze, his eyes widening in absolute terror. "What did you do?" he whispered. "When you run a crypto fund, you rely on a primary liquidity provider to process your withdrawals and maintain your offshore wallets," I explained, breaking the mechanics down so clearly that even Chloe could finally understand the depth of their total ruin. "Your primary provider was a mid-sized digital asset exchange based out of the Cayman Islands. You relied on them entirely to hide your fraudulent transfers and cover up your massive trading losses." I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the absolute power I held in this exact moment. "I used a very tiny fraction of my new El Oriel capital this afternoon." I continued, my voice echoing with total finality. "Just a few $1 million, pocket change really. And I executed a hostile buyout of that exact digital asset exchange." Darius let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He stumbled backward, his knees going completely weak. "You cannot do that," he choked out, completely losing his grip on reality. "That is illegal. You cannot just buy a company to get to me." It is entirely legal, Darius Vice assured him. I am the new majority shareholder, and my very first act as the new owner was to order a complete external audit of all anonymous wallets associated with your fund. I had my team unmask your accounts. I exposed the massive deficit to the regulatory authorities. And then about 10 minutes ago, I instructed the exchange to automatically issue margin calls on every single leveraged position you hold. Chloe looked at Darius, her eyes wide with total horror. Darius, what is she talking about? Chloe demanded, grabbing his arm forcefully. Tell her she is lying. Tell me our money is safe. Darius could not look at his wife. He stared at the floor, his entire body trembling violently. He knew exactly what a margin call meant for a Ponzi scheme. It meant instant catastrophic exposure. He cannot tell you it is safe, Chloe, I said softly, because the money is completely gone. As if perfectly timed by the universe itself, the silence in the room was suddenly shattered by a rapid succession of sharp electronic chiming sounds. Ping, ping, ping. The noises were coming from Darius's pockets. His cell phone was going off. But it was not just one notification. It was a relentless machine gun barrage of loud alerts. Ping, 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 ping. Darius scrambled to pull his phone out of his jacket pocket. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the device onto the hardwood floor. He unlocked the screen, and the bright light reflected off his terrified, sweaty face. I did not need to see the screen to know exactly what was happening. Those are your investors, Darius, I announced to the room. The audit triggered automated risk alerts across the entire network. All of Vivian's wealthy friends at the country club just received an email stating that your fund is entirely insolvent. They are logging into their accounts right now and hitting the panic button. No, Darius whimpered furiously, tapping the screen of his phone, as if he could somehow stop the digital avalanche with his fingers. No, no, no. This cannot be happening. Stop it. You have to stop it. They are all trying to withdraw their funds simultaneously, I explained calmly, watching the absolute destruction of his massive ego. It is a classic bank run. But since you spent all of their money on fake diamond watches and expensive steak dinners, the liquidity pool is completely empty. The withdrawal requests are bouncing. And by tomorrow morning, every single one of those elite country club members is going to realize you stole their life savings. Ping, ping, ping. The phone continued to scream in his hand, a digital death knell for his fraudulent empire. Chloe snatched the phone right out of his hands. She stared at the screen, watching the endless stream of withdrawal failures and angry text messages flooding in from their friends and family members. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream and threw the phone directly at Darius's chest. It clattered to the floor, still pinging endlessly. You stole my mother's friend's money! Chloe shrieked, hitting his chest with her fists. You told me we were rich. You told me you were a genius. We are going to go to jail. Officer Harrison stepped forward, pulling a small silver voice recorder from his belt. Mr. Washington, Officer Harrison said, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. Based on the statements made in this room and the digital evidence currently presenting itself on your device, I am going to have to ask you to step outside with us. We need to have a very long conversation about your financial operations. Darius looked at the officer, then at his screaming wife, and finally at the phone still chiming relentlessly on the floor. He was completely trapped. There was no clever lie or flashy suit that could save him from the federal indictment coming his way. His Ponzi scheme was dead. His reputation was permanently destroyed. Darius was officially bankrupt, facing years in a federal penitentiary, all because he tried to humiliate a woman who secretly owned his entire world. Officer Harrison placed a firm hand on Darius's shoulder and physically guided the completely shattered man toward the heavy oak doors. Darius did not even try to resist. He walked like a zombie, his expensive shoes scuffing against the polished floor, leaving behind the ruined fragments of his fake cryptocurrency empire. Chloe scrambled after them, her diamond rings flashing under the chandeliers as she grabbed her ruined phone from the floor. She chased her husband out into the hallway, her hysterical sobs echoing loudly before the wooden doors swung shut, cutting off the pathetic noise entirely. The private dining room was suddenly much emptier, but the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of total defeat remained. Vivian was still slumped in her chair at the head of the table, clutching her chest and gasping for air, as if she were actively drowning. Her historic mansion, her law firm, and her elite social standing were all completely vaporized in less than 20 minutes. But there was still one person left in the room who had not yet faced the absolute crushing reality of his own catastrophic arrogance. Julian. My cowardly, calculating husband had been standing completely frozen against the mahogany-paneled wall this entire time. He had watched me systematically dismantle his mother and entirely destroy his brother-in-law. He had heard the J.P. Morgan executive confirm the $1.2 billion acquisition of my company, and slowly, agonizingly, the gears in his mediocre brain finally began to turn. I watched the exact moment the realization hit him. The last remaining drops of blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a freshly embalmed corpse. His jaw trembled violently. His eyes darted from my face to the empty space where Darius had just been standing, and finally down to his own expensive suit jacket. His hand began to shake uncontrollably as it hovered over his inner breast pocket, the pocket where he was currently storing the heavy parchment envelope. The envelope containing the divorce papers he had forced me to sign in the hallway just 30 minutes ago. The sheer gravity of what he had done finally crushed whatever was left of his spine. Julian let out a hollow, agonizing groan that sounded like a dying animal. His knees buckled completely, and he collapsed onto the hardwood floor, dropping hard onto his expensive tailored trousers. He did not care about the wrinkles or the dirt. He did not care that the restaurant manager and several waiters were watching him fall apart. He plunged his shaking hand into his jacket pocket and ripped the heavy parchment envelope out. He fumbled with the flap, his fingers completely devoid of any coordination. He was breathing in short, desperate gasps, completely blinded by the panic of losing $1 billion. He finally managed to pull the neatly stapled legal documents out of the envelope. He stared at the bold black ink, seeing my precise, elegant signature on the bottom line, the signature he had smugly demanded, the signature he thought was his grand victory. Julian grabbed the top of the thick paper stack with both hands, his knuckles turning white as he prepared to rip the documents into tiny, unrecognizable shreds. He thought he could just destroy the physical evidence and somehow rewind time. He thought he could erase his betrayal by simply tearing up the paper and pretending he had never ambushed me in the hallway. He thought I would actually let him get away with it. I moved faster than he could ever anticipate. I took 2 quick, deliberate steps across the polished floor. Before he could even begin to tear the first page, I raised my right foot and brought the sharp metal heel of my stiletto down directly onto the back of his hand. I did not stomp hard enough to break any bones, but I applied enough concentrated pressure to send a sharp, shocking wave of pain straight up his arm. Julian yelped loudly, his grip instantly releasing the thick parchment paper. He pulled his hand back, clutching it against his chest as he looked up at me from the floor. His eyes were wide with a mixture of physical pain and profound, terrifying realization. He was looking at a woman he did not recognize at all. For 5 years, he had known a supportive, quiet wife who swallowed her pride to keep the peace. Now he was looking down the barrel of a completely ruthless billionaire who was entirely done playing the victim. I reached down smoothly and picked up the pristine divorce papers from the hardwood floor. I checked the corners to ensure he had not managed to tear them, then calmly brushed a speck of dust off the front page. I folded the documents neatly and slipped them directly into my own purse, securing them safely next to my phone. Julian scrambled forward on his knees, reaching his hands out toward me in a pathetic, begging gesture. "Zoe, please!" Julian cried out, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "Please give those back to me. I made a massive mistake. I was not thinking clearly. Mother put so much pressure on me to protect the firm, and I just panicked. You know I love you. You know I never actually wanted a divorce. We can tear those up right now and pretend tonight never happened. We can go home together. We can fix this." I looked down at him kneeling at my feet and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, And certainly no love, just a deep, abiding emptiness where my respect for him used to live. "Oh no, Julian," I said, my voice dripping with cold, mocking finality. "You filed these. You drafted the terms yourself with your mother's brilliant legal guidance. You demanded the house and absolutely nothing else. You wanted to make sure you were completely shielded from my supposedly failing business. So I gave you exactly what you asked for." I took a slight step back, looking down at his pathetic, tear-stained face. "Congratulations, Julian," I announced, ensuring my voice carried clearly across the quiet room. "You get a $400,000 townhouse. Of course, that townhouse is currently attached to a massive mortgage that you now have to pay entirely by yourself. And since your mother's law firm is going into complete default tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock, I highly doubt you will have the junior partner salary required to cover those massive monthly payments. But hey, at least you got the prime real estate you desperately wanted, and in exchange you have legally, permanently, and irrevocably waived all rights to my $1.2 billion fortune." Julian let out a gut-wrenching sob and buried his face in his hands. He curled into a tight, pathetic ball on the hard wooden floor, weeping loudly like a completely broken and entirely helpless child. He had traded unimaginable wealth and a loyal wife for a heavily mortgaged property, and the approval of a mother who was currently hyperventilating in the corner. The sheer poetry of his massive self-destruction was almost beautiful to witness. While Julian wept on the floor, the tall, impeccably groomed restaurant manager stepped fully into the room. He had stood silently by the door, watching the entire elite family completely implode. He had seen the fake watch expose the Ponzi scheme, dismantled the secret debts revealed, and the billion-dollar buyout completely confirmed. He now knew exactly who the real fraud in this private dining room actually was. And he was absolutely furious that he had been manipulated into calling the Chicago police on his wealthiest patron. The manager completely ignored Julian crying pathetically on the floor. He walked straight past me with a highly respectful deferential nod and marched directly toward the head of the heavy mahogany dining table. He stopped right next to Vivian, who was still gasping for air, her face completely buried in a white linen napkin. The manager did not offer her a glass of fresh water. He did not ask if she was feeling unwell today. He picked up the sleek black leather folder containing the $8,542 receipt and dropped it loudly onto the mahogany table right in front of her face. "Madam," the manager said, his voice entirely devoid of the polite hospitality he had shown her earlier this evening, "the bill remains completely unsettled. Since this young woman is clearly not the fraud you falsely claimed she was, you are now fully responsible for this holiday dinner. I need immediate payment in full right now." Vivian looked up at the angry manager, her eyes extremely wide with total panic. She reached into her designer bag with trembling hands and quickly pulled out a shiny gold credit card. The manager snatched it, ran it through his handheld digital terminal, and smiled coldly. "Declined," he announced loudly. "Try another one, madam, or I will have the officers waiting outside arrest you for theft of services right now." The word "declined" hung in the air like an execution order. Vivian stared at the glowing red screen in absolute disbelief. She frantically dug through her purse, her hands shaking so violently that her makeup compact spilled onto the floor, shattering into pale powder. She pulled out 2 more cards, handing them to the manager with desperate eyes. The manager swiped the first one, declined. He swiped the second one, declined. Every single line of credit she possessed was maxed out, choked by the secret debts she had hidden for years. Officer Harrison stepped fully back into the room, his partner beside him. Their patience was completely exhausted. "Ma'am," Officer Harrison said, his voice entirely unsympathetic. "You called emergency dispatch claiming you were the victim of a violent assault and financial fraud. It is now abundantly clear you fabricated the entire story to cover up your own inability to pay for this dinner. Filing a false police report is a serious criminal offense, and attempting to defraud a restaurant of $8,500 is theft of services. I need you to stand up and step into the hallway right now." Vivian let out a high-pitched wail. She looked at her son Julian, who was still curled up on the hardwood floor, utterly paralyzed by his own loss. He offered her absolutely no help. Darius was already standing near the doorway, flanked by the younger officer, his face completely devoid of his previous arrogant swagger. The untouchable facade of the Washington family was gone. They were just a group of desperate criminals about to be escorted out in handcuffs. Before Officer Harrison could physically reach for Vivian, the heavy wooden doors swung open one final time. A massive man dressed in a tactical gray security uniform stepped into the room. He wore a heavy protective vest and carried a secure titanium lockbox attached to his wrist by a thick steel cable. He completely ignored the weeping woman, the broken man on the floor, and the police officers. His eyes scanned the room briefly before locking directly onto me. Ms. Zoe Hayes, the security guard, asked, his voice deep and highly professional. Yes, I replied smoothly. I am here on behalf of J.P. Morgan Chase, he announced, confirming my identity with a quick glance at a digital tablet. I have a priority delivery that requires your immediate biometric signature. He held out the tablet. I pressed my thumb against the glowing green sensor. The tablet chimed a pleasant note of approval. The guard unhooked the steel cable, entered a complex code into the titanium lockbox, and popped the lid open. He carefully extracted a sleek, heavy, matte black envelope and handed it to me. Thank you for your business, Ms. Hayes, the guard said respectfully. Have a truly wonderful evening. He turned and walked out of the room just as swiftly as he had entered. I slid my finger under the seal and pulled out the card. It was forged from solid anodized titanium. The Centurion card. The ultimate symbol of limitless financial power, devoid of any preset spending limits. The heavy metal felt incredibly cool and solid against my skin. It was the physical manifestation of my newly acquired billionaire status. The restaurant manager watched me holding the titanium card, his eyes wide with absolute awe. He took a hesitant step toward me, hoping I would settle the massive bill and save his restaurant from a messy police intervention. But I had absolutely no intention of bailing Vivian out of the trap she had deliberately set for herself. I walked over to the manager and held out the heavy metal card. I would like to settle my portion of the bill, please, I said politely. The manager looked confused. Your portion, madam? He asked nervously. Yes, I replied, offering him a warm and perfectly polite smile. I did not consume the expensive wine. I did not order the tomahawk steaks. All I had tonight was a single glass of sparkling water. Please charge my card for the water. Leave the rest of the $8,500 balance to the woman sitting at the head of the table. After all, she insisted this was a family dinner, and I am officially no longer a part of this family. The manager nodded slowly, understanding the lethal nature of my request. He tapped a few buttons, charged me exactly $8, and handed the titanium card back with a deep bow. Thank you for visiting the Wellington, Ms. Hayes, he said. We hope to see you again soon. I slipped the card into my purse next to the signed divorce papers. I turned around and looked at the miserable people in the room one last time. Vivian was sobbing as Officer Harrison pulled her out of the chair. Julian was staring blankly at the wall. Darius was being read his rights. They were entirely consumed by the roaring flames of their own spectacular destruction. I did not say a single word of goodbye. I simply turned my back on them and walked out of the private dining room. I walked down the long hallway, completely ignoring the curious stares of the other patrons. I pushed open the heavy glass front doors of the Wellington Steakhouse and stepped out into the freezing Chicago snow. The crisp winter air felt incredibly refreshing against my skin. A massive black Rolls-Royce Phantom was already idling at the curb, sent by my new wealth management team. The uniformed chauffeur stepped out and opened the rear door for me. I slid into the warm, luxurious leather back seat. As the car silently pulled away from the curb, I looked out the tinted window one final time. I watched the red and blue flashing lights of the police cruisers reflecting off the restaurant windows. I was leaving my treacherous husband, my venomous mother-in-law, and their fake elite empire to crumble into dust behind me.